Hi, John Morgan here with the Keep Growing podcast. In our last episode, we talked about the importance of light when it comes to growing plants. This week, we're going to look at another aspect of gardening that is also largely dependent on the sun and seasons. That is, we're going to be discussing how climate affects the types of plants we can grow in a region, and how we can sometimes trick nature by growing warm weather plants in colder climates. Speaking of warm weather, through the magic of the internet, I'm currently sitting on a beach taking a much needed vacation. Also, I don't have a guest this week, so expect a slightly shorter podcast than normal. When I get back from vacation, I'll be heading to Columbus, Ohio for Cultivate 18, one of the largest horticultural conferences and trade shows in the U.S. You can follow along with me on our website at bobsmarket.com and on Facebook as I share updates from the conference. After that side note, let's get back to the topic at hand. Due to the Earth's tilt on its axis, we experience seasons. And the farther north or south you go, the colder it gets in the winter. However, plants have adapted to living in pretty extreme environments either through going dormant in the winter, producing seeds, or just through adaptation to survive extremely cold temperatures. First of all, when it comes to gardening in your area, a first step is to know how cold it gets in the winter. This is where hardiness zones come in. Here in the U.S., we have hardiness zones that are defined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but most other countries have their own systems too. For example, the UK has a zone system defined by the Royal Horticultural Society. Basically, these zones map out the coldest temperatures an area can expect to experience during the winter. Originally, the USDA hardiness zones were 10 zones from the coldest areas of Alaska to the warmest parts of Florida, with 1 being the coldest and 10 being the warmest. Later, these zones were divided into A and B zones to highlight more subtle differences. For example, our headquarters here at Bob's is in Zone 6A, but when I drive home 30 miles south, I cross into Zone 6B. This highlights that the average temperature at my house is actually about 5 degrees warmer than our headquarters. Another thing to keep in mind is that your zone just represents the coldest temperature you can expect throughout the year. It doesn't represent the average first and last frost dates. A good example of this is that our Gallipolis, Ohio location here in the Mid-Ohio Valley is in Zone 6B and has an average last frost date around Mother's Day weekend. Our Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania location is also in Zone 6B, but its last frost date is around Memorial Day weekend. To find your local first and last frost dates, I recommend hitting up your favorite search engine or contacting your local extension office. I'll also include a link in the show notes to help you find out what hardiness zone you're located in. When it comes to choosing plants for your landscape, this knowledge is very important. Likewise, knowing whether a potential plant choice is an annual, perennial, or something different is important too. So first of all, what in the heck do those terms even mean? Let's start off with annuals. Annuals are plants that only live for 1 year. They sprout, bloom, and produce seed typically during the warmer part of the year, and then the seeds survive until the next spring if the climate is warm enough. Most of the plants we grow here at Bob's are flowering annuals. Some annuals need to be deadheaded, that is, removing spent blooms. Since their main drive is to produce seed before winter, removing spent blooms trigger the plant to produce even more blooms in an effort to produce more seed. They'll do whatever it takes to pass on their genes to the next generation. Also, since many of these flowers, like impatiens, are from tropical climates, their seeds are unable to survive our cold winters. The opposite of annuals are perennials. Perennials are plants that live for more than 2 years. In tropical areas where the climate is warm, this is a pretty simple concept. In our region where we have cold winters, plants are adapted to deal with that cold. either through going dormant, like trees losing their leaves in the winter. They do that to stave off damage from cold, and also the reduced light levels that are available in the winter. Or you have plants like evergreens that are just equipped to deal with the cold. Finally, you have plants that don't really fit into the annual or perennial category. Biennials are a good example of these. A plant like foxglove takes 2 seasons to grow and produce seeds. They're a prolific seed producer and tend to reseed themselves. Because of this, many people mistake them for a perennial. Then there's also plants that can go dormant for long periods of time in dry desert conditions, only coming out of dormancy when they're exposed to moisture. To further muddy the waters, some plants are actually perennials in warmer climates and are grown as annuals in areas that experience colder winters. In our area, fall mums are a good example of this. We're on the border of their survivability range, so basically you have a 50-50 shot on them surviving the winter. I had a mum survive for a few years next to my house, but was eventually killed by a particularly cold winter a few years ago. As a result, we sell mums as an annual in our retail locations. Then you have plants that can get a little help from us. Take elephant ears. In the northern states, we can dig up the bulbs and take them into cool garages or basements to survive the winter. Like light in our last episode, when considering what plants to use in your landscape, a plant's tolerance to your local climate and also its growth cycle are important to consider. Generally, a well-rounded landscape will have a mix of perennials and annuals. Perennials act kind of like the foundation in your garden. They provide a backdrop for the more showy summer annuals. Light conditions, annuals versus perennials, hardiness zones, plant size, flower color. Tender plants, woody perennials, vines, shrubs, trees. The list of factors to consider when choosing plants is a mile long. Sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming, but it's also fun at the same time. Letting your imagination run wild when planning your landscape is perhaps one of the things I enjoy most about gardening. I think gardeners are dreamers who like to let their imaginations run wild and plan for seasons to come. This week's bit of gardening wisdom comes from Dr. Alan Armitage, Professor Emeritus of Horticulture at the University of Georgia. In the horticulture industry, Dr. Armitage, he's kind of like Yoda. I'll put a link to his website and YouTube channel in the comments. Dr. A says, "There are many tired gardeners, but I've seldom met old gardeners. I know many elderly gardeners, but the majority are young at heart. Gardening simply does not allow one to be mentally old, because too many hopes and dreams are yet to be realized. The one absolute of gardeners is faith. Regardless of how bad past gardens have been, every gardener believes that next year's will be better. It's easy to age when there's nothing to believe in, nothing to hope for. Gardeners, however, simply refuse to grow up." And with that, I'll say never grow up, just keep growing. For some more great information about USDA hardiness zones, diagrams, and more about this episode, check out our show notes at bobsmarket.com/keepgrowing. If you're listening on iTunes, Google Play, or other platforms, be sure to give us a review. You can also learn more about bulbs through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and more. If you want to contact me directly with questions, comments, or smart remarks, shoot me an email at keepgrowing@bobsmarket.com. The music in this week's episode is by Dan Leibowitz. Copyright 2018, Bob's Market and Greenhouses, Incorporated.